This again is where you come to a series of mysteries which are perhaps best expressed on the Giza Plateau.
The King's Chamber is built entirely from granite. 70-ton blocks, surfaces flat to 1,000th of an inch, joints so tight a razor blade won't pass between them. For 100 years, every Egyptologist on Earth agreed they knew how it was done. Then, a material scientist with zero background in Egyptology pointed a scanning electron microscope at an ancient cut surface, and the 100-year answer was wrong.
In my opinion, is the most important discovery on the 21st century.
Graham Hancock had been saying so for 4 decades. Now, there is proof. The mystery nobody could solve. Here is the deal. The pyramids are not the real mystery of ancient Egypt. Most of those structures are limestone, and we can explain how limestone was shaped and moved. Limestone is soft. Limestone is workable. Limestone makes sense. The real mystery, the one that has quietly haunted engineers and stonemasons and materials scientists for over a century, is the granite. Granite rates 6 to 7 on the Mohs hardness scale. It is composed of quartz, feldspar, and mica, minerals so resistant to cutting that even today, with diamond-tipped power tools and industrial coolants and computer-controlled machinery, working granite is slow, expensive, and punishing. It does not yield, it fights back. Yet the ancient Egyptians shaped it like clay. The King's Chamber inside the Great Pyramid is constructed entirely of granite blocks, some weighing over 70 tons. The Valley Temple at Giza holds massive granite pieces fitted with joints so precise you cannot slide a razor blade between them. Statues carved from single blocks show surface details so fine they appear machined to modern eyes. And drill cores pulled from ancient sites reveal spiral grooves descending into solid stone at feed rates that make manufacturing engineers stop mid-sentence and reach for their calculators. These are not isolated anomalies. They are consistent across sites, across centuries, across the entire span of ancient Egyptian civilization at its peak. The precision is not occasional, it is systematic. A single exceptional artifact could be an outlier. Systematic, repeatable precision at industrial scale is something else entirely. It is a technology, and a technology leaves traces. Chris Dunn is a precision machining engineer. 40 years surrounded by CNC machines, ground components, tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. This is his entire professional world. When he examined ancient Egyptian granite artifacts firsthand, he did not reach for poetic language. He used the language of his trade, industrial. He said the tolerances he was seeing, surfaces flat to within 1,000th of an inch across several meters, drill holes maintaining perfect circularity through their entire depth, were not just impressive, they were specifications. The ancient Egyptians had not approximated precision. They had achieved it with the consistency of engineered process. He said he had spent his entire career surrounded by the most advanced manufacturing equipment in the world, and what he was looking at in those ancient artifacts matched or exceeded what that equipment produces today. Not approximately, precisely. Here's the catch. That word, specifications, carries enormous weight. Specifications imply intent. They imply method. They imply a system sophisticated enough to produce the same result repeatedly across generations. So, the question that has haunted Egyptology for over 100 years is a deceptively simple one. How? The answer. That does not work for generations. The accepted explanation has been copper saws loaded with sand as an abrasive, copper tools, dolerite pounders, patience. That is the orthodox model, taught in universities, repeated in documentaries, printed in textbooks without serious revision since the 19th century. And get this, the physics does not work. Copper rates approximately 2.5 to 3 on the Mohs hardness scale. Granite's quartz component rates 7. When you attempt to cut a harder material with a softer one, even with abrasive assist, the tool destroys itself before the stone yields in any meaningful way. The harder material wins. That is not a theory. That is tribology. It is what friction and wear mechanics actually do. Dennis Stocks is an experimental archaeologist at the University of Manchester, a man who has dedicated years to understanding exactly how ancient craftsmen worked stone. He is not a critic of the ancient Egyptians. He is an advocate. He spent years testing the copper and sand hypothesis under controlled conditions. copper tools, sand abrasive, actual granite, precise measurement at every stage. The results were not ambiguous. 0.5 millimeter of progress per hour, heavy copper degradation after short periods, cut surfaces rough and uneven, looking nothing like the smooth precision of the artifacts in Cairo's Egyptian Museum. Stocks himself, the experiment's designer, the man who believed the hypothesis when he started, admitted the experiments raised more questions than they answered. Dolerite pounders do work. You can shape granite with percussion. But here's what nobody talks about: the speed. Shaping even a modest granite surface through percussion alone requires hundreds of hours of relentless physical labor. Scale that to the king's chamber, hundreds of massive blocks, every surface finished, every joint fitted to razor blade tolerance. And you need millions of labor hours for granite alone. Before you move a single block, before you lift a single course. And neither method, not copper with sand, not dolerite pounders, explains the precision. Surfaces flat to thousandths of an inch. Drill holes maintaining perfect circularity through their entire depth. Saw cuts straight and parallel across meters of stone. You do not achieve that with rocks and soft metal, not with any amount of patience, not in any number of labor hours. The method does not produce the result. Full stop. For 40 years, Graham Hancock kept saying exactly this. The physical evidence does not match the conventional explanation. Something is missing, and mainstream archaeology responded the same way. Every single time. Hancock is not trained. His questions are not worth answering. Ignore him. Until he found what was missing. If the idea that 100 years of textbook answers might have missed something, this fundamental makes you want to keep pulling threads. Subscribe. This channel follows the evidence wherever it leads, not where the institutions point. The discovery. In 2022, Hancock partnered with Dr. Masoud Garb. Here is who Garb is, because it matters. He is not an archaeologist. He is not a historian. He is a materials scientist specializing in tribology, the study of friction, wear, and lubrication, at a leading research institution. A compact, precise man who speaks the language of surfaces and forces and molecular level behavior. He had no stake in the ancient Egypt debate, no career invested in protecting any particular story, no reason to want any specific outcome. He was a hard scientist, invited to apply hard science to an old question. They obtained permission to examine ancient Egyptian granite artifacts using scanning electron microscopy and energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy. Instruments that resolve surface features at the molecular level, features completely invisible to any optical microscope, no matter how powerful. And here's what nobody tells you. These instruments had never been applied to this specific question before. The surfaces of ancient Egyptian granite cuts had been examined visually, measured optically, photographed in extraordinary detail. They had never been interrogated at the molecular level. No one thought to look that deep because the answer was already in the textbooks. Dr. Garb set up the equipment expecting to find exactly what Egyptologists had always described: sand particles, copper residue, the chemical fingerprint of brute force abrasion. He was a scientist without attachment to the outcome. He aimed the instrument at a cut surface and let the data speak. The wear patterns were wrong. Think about what that means. A materials scientist, someone whose entire professional expertise is reading the microscopic story that friction leaves on surfaces, looked at a 4,000-year-old cut and said, "This was not done the way everyone said it was done. The scratch signatures did not match sand. The directionality was inconsistent. The depth profiles were wrong for quartz abrasive under copper tooling. Something else had been doing the cutting." Dr. Garb began isolating what was actually embedded in those ancient grooves. What had been sitting undisturbed in cuts made before Rome existed, before Greece's golden age, before the Trojan War. He ran the spectroscopy. He studied the readout. He cross-referenced it. He ran it again. He sat back from the microscope, and he called Hancock into the lab. He did not lead with an explanation. He pointed at the screen. What he had found does not occur naturally in Egypt in any form suitable for industrial use. It is harder than anything in Egypt's natural geology. Modern industry uses the synthetic version of it every day to cut, grind, and finish the hardest materials known to engineering. It had been sitting in those 4,000-year-old grooves for the entirety of recorded human history. and no one had ever looked for it, because no one had ever considered the possibility that the ancient Egyptians understood material science at the level required to use it deliberately. That is what the proof is, and that is why it changes everything. But here is where Dr. Garb's expertise becomes the most important part of the story. He was not just the instrument operator. He understood what the finding implied. He said, and he said it unequivocally, that using this material effectively requires understanding mineral hardness at a sophisticated level. You have to identify it among dozens of visually similar minerals. You have to recognize its properties. You have to experiment systematically until you understand optimal particle size for the specific application. You have to formulate and refine a cutting slurry through iterative testing. He said this was not lucky improvisation. This was not someone who found a hard rock and started scraping. This was material science, deliberate, systematic, generationally refined material science, practiced 4,000 years before the discipline had a name. The experiments. A microscopic finding is evidence. It is not yet proof. Hancock knew the difference. He had spent 40 years being accused of presenting impressive evidence without reproducible proof, and he was not going to stop short of that line now. What came next was replication. In early 2023, Hancock organized controlled experimental trials. SAA, workshop, granite blocks, copper tools, 3 abrasive formulations tested against each other under identical conditions, stonemasons and materials, scientists working side by side. And get this, the 3 abrasives represented 3 distinct theories. Sand, the orthodox answer, the 100-year textbook model, quartz powder, slightly harder than sand, naturally available in ancient Egypt, a plausible refinement that the archaeological record could support, a corundum quartz slurry, the new hypothesis, what the molecular evidence suggested the ancients had actually used. The results destroyed any remaining ambiguity. Copper with sand, 0.5 millimeter per hour. Painful. Heavy tool wear after short periods. Cut surfaces rough and inconsistent, matching Stock's earlier experiments almost exactly. The official theory, tested to its limits, performing exactly as its critics had always predicted it would. Copper with quartz powder, approximately 0.8 millimeters per hour. Marginally better, still nowhere near the productivity that could explain ancient Egyptian stonework at scale. Still producing surfaces that looked nothing like museum artifacts. Then they ran the corundum quartz slurry, over 3 millimeters per hour, 6 times faster than sand. The copper tools lasted dramatically longer. The abrasive was transferring energy from the tool to the stone instead of destroying the tool in the process. The cuts came out smooth, clean, and accurate. Think about what that speed differential means at actual pyramid scale. If the orthodox method produced 0.5 millimeter per hour of progress and the corundum slurry produced over 3, the entire labor calculation for building the king's chamber changes. The workforce required to finish those granite surfaces compresses by a factor of 6. The timeline compresses. The logistical burden shrinks. The operation shifts from something that strains the boundaries of human organizational capacity to something a sophisticated, well-administered civilization could execute. The physics works. The numbers work. For the first time, the numbers actually work. But none of that was the part that silenced the room. The drilling was the part that silenced the room. Nick Giza has spent decades working granite, not studying it, working it. A veteran stonemason with enough years of experience that his hands know granite the way a musician's hands know their instrument. He knows what ancient Egyptian drill cores look like. He has held them. When the corundum slurry went to work in that workshop, he described what happened in terms that carry the weight of his entire career behind them. He said everything changed. The copper stopped fighting the granite and started guiding the abrasive. The cut went smooth. The speed jumped. The tool wear dropped. And the drill cores, he said this is the part he could not get over. The drill cores came out with spiral grooves. The same spiral, grooves found in ancient Egyptian cores, the same grooves that had baffled manufacturing engineers for decades. The same grooves the copper and sand theory had never, under any experimental conditions, managed to reproduce. Right there on the workshop table, cut fresh into modern granite by a method 4,000 years old, He said for the first time in his entire career, standing in that workshop, he could see how the ancients actually did it.
Okay, well, what is actually going to do the cutting? It seems to me that copper is just going to blunt on granite. I can't believe it's going to cut the stone.
Not theorize, see. But here is what nobody expected. The experiments revealed that the corundum slurry was not forgiving. It demanded genuine skill. The mixture had to be maintained at precise consistency. Too thin, and it lost cutting power. Abrasive particles dispersing before they could do work. Too thick, and it clogged the groove. Heat built, progress stalled. Pressure had to be applied evenly. Temperature had to be managed. Every variable interacted with every other in ways that required constant, experienced adjustment. You could not give this method to an untrained laborer. It demanded master craftsmen, people who had spent years learning the behavior of stone and copper and abrasive slurry under their hands. People who had inherited that knowledge from masters before them, refined it, and passed it forward through apprenticeships that stretched back further than any written record survives. Think about what that means. Exactly the kind of specialized workforce you would expect from a civilization that built the pyramids. 3 independent lines of evidence: microscopic analysis, experimental replication, material science data, all pointing at the same conclusion. And what that conclusion demands is not a primitive labor force grinding rocks against stone. It demands a professional class of material specialists operating at a level no institution had ever thought to look for. The question was no longer whether the corundum hypothesis was plausible. The question was how the academic establishment was going to respond. The gatekeepers, Hancock, had been here before. He knew what was coming. He presented the findings at a material science conference in late 2023, not an archaeology conference, a room full of engineers, physicists, and material scientists who evaluate claims on evidence and methodology, people with no institutional investment in the copper and sand narrative, no career stake in any particular story about the ancient world. The response was largely positive. Specialists in friction and wear mechanics found the tribological analysis credible. Engineers found the experimental replication compelling. Dr. James Harold, a geological archaeologist who has spent decades studying ancient Egyptian quarrying, noted something important that often gets overlooked. Abrasive slurries do not preserve in the archaeological record. Organic binders decay. Loose particles scatter. Liquids evaporate. You will never find a labeled jar of ancient abrasive powder in an excavation, but corundum traces embedded in the actual cut surfaces, locked inside the stone itself, might be, as Harold described it, the best physical evidence we will ever recover. The absence of preserved slurry is not evidence against the hypothesis. It is exactly what the hypothesis predicts. But here is where it gets uncomfortable. When the findings reached mainstream Egyptology, the response fractured. Some archaeologists engaged with genuine scientific curiosity. And this deserves acknowledgement, because it is how a field is supposed to work. They asked the right questions. How much of this material would industrial-scale application actually require? Is there direct archaeological or documentary evidence of the relevant trade networks during the Old Kingdom period specifically? Could the molecular traces in the cut surfaces represent later contamination from handling, storage, or modern contact rather than original use? These are good faith scientific questions. You do not dismiss them. You design experiments to answer them. You follow the data wherever it leads, even if it leads somewhere inconvenient. A significant portion of the academic establishment did not engage with the science at all. They engaged with the name, Graham Hancock, the outsider, the man who wrote Fingerprints of the Gods, the man they had dismissed in journals, mocked at conferences, and called a pseudoscientist for 40 years. Their position was clear and entirely unapologetic. Hancock's involvement taints the findings regardless of scientific merit. The data did not matter. The replication did not matter. The name on the paper was disqualifying. Hancock addressed this directly in a 2024 interview. He said Egyptologists told him that even if he was right about the corundum, even if the molecular evidence was exactly what he claimed, even if the experimental replication was valid, even if credentialed scientists with no reason to protect any narrative had reviewed and endorsed the methodology, he should not be the one saying it. that his lack of formal training disqualified him from presenting a finding, regardless of the quality of the evidence behind it. He said it was never about truth, it was about gatekeeping, and that response revealed something more significant than any mineral trace in any ancient cut. The resistance was never about evidence, it was about authority, about which institutions hold the right to revise the story of human civilization, about ensuring that outsiders, regardless of the quality of their evidence, regardless of the credentialed scientists standing beside them, never get to hold that authority. Evidence does not care about credentials, and the corundum hypothesis has gained traction precisely where it matters, among engineers, materials scientists, and a growing number of archaeologists willing to examine data on its merits, regardless of who collected it. What this changes, let us be precise about something, because precision matters here. The corundum discovery does not validate every theory Graham Hancock has ever proposed. His broader arguments about lost pre-Ice Age civilizations remain scientifically contested. Reasonable experts with genuine credentials disagree on those questions. That disagreement is legitimate. But on this specific testable physical question, how did ancient Egyptians cut granite with the precision that modern manufacturing engineers find remarkable? The evidence supports the challenge. The orthodox explanation does not produce the result. The new evidence does. And if the ancient Egyptians were deliberately sourcing this material from distant trade partners, processing it into calibrated abrasive particles, and formulating cutting slurries with precise viscosity requirements, then their technological profile requires fundamental revision. Here is what that actually means. They understood mineral hardness at a sophisticated, systematic level, not vaguely, not accidentally, with enough precision to identify a specific mineral among dozens of visually similar alternatives, recognize its cutting properties, and deliberately incorporate it into an industrial process. That is not luck. That requires knowledge. They maintain long-distance trade networks specifically for industrial materials unavailable in the Nile Valley. Sourcing this material in sufficient quantities, transporting it, and distributing it to construction sites at pyramid building scale is not a casual operation. It implies established trade relationships, administrative infrastructure, and a strategic understanding that this specific material was worth the logistical investment. They developed and transmitted processing techniques across generations, grinding to optimal particle sizes, formulating slurries to precise consistency, passing that knowledge from master to apprentice across centuries through projects spanning multiple reigns. Someone developed this, someone refined it, someone taught it, and the knowledge survived long enough to be applied at scale across the most ambitious construction program in human history. They were not struggling against their environment with inadequate tools. They were engineering their environment with sophisticated ones. And the civilization they built on that foundation, the monuments, the temples, the engineered precision that outlasted every empire that came after, was the product not of brute force and unlimited slave labor, but of knowledge, deep, systematic, transmissible knowledge. The kind of knowledge that, once lost, leaves behind artifacts so remarkable that everyone who comes after assumes they must have required technology we cannot explain. They have been waiting 4,000 years for someone to look with the right instrument. The question that should keep every archaeologist awake. If we miss this, an entire abrasive technology hiding in plain sight in surfaces examined by thousands of researchers over more than a century. What else have we missed? Scanning electron microscopy exists. Energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy exists. Tribological surface analysis exists. None of these techniques are exotic or prohibitively expensive. They were available. They were simply never applied to this question because the question was considered settled. The answer was in the textbooks. Why would anyone look closer? Graham Hancock looked closer. For 40 years, he pointed at the gap between what the evidence showed and what the explanation claimed and said, something does not fit. He was mocked for it, dismissed, excluded from journals and conferences by a field that confused institutional authority with intellectual correctness, told repeatedly that his lack of formal training disqualified him from asking questions that his formal training would have told him not to ask. And then he brought proof, not theory, not the passionate. Speculation his critics spent 40 years dismissing. Physical evidence examined at the molecular level by a materials scientist with no reason to want a particular outcome. Experimental replication that produced ancient matching results, including those unexplained spiral drill grooves, for the first time in the history of experimental archaeology. Material science reviewed and endorsed by engineers and physicists who evaluated the methodology on its merits. The ancient Egyptians cut granite using a sophisticated abrasive technology. They sourced industrial-grade materials through long-distance trade networks. They formulated cutting slurries through systematic experimentation. They refined those techniques across generations of master craftsmen. They achieved precision that matches modern manufacturing specifications. Not because they had modern machines, but because they had deep material knowledge and the generational continuity to apply it at scale. They were not primitive. They were not struggling. They were not lucky. They were brilliant, and they operated inside a knowledge system so sophisticated, so deliberately constructed and carefully maintained that it produced precision engineering at a scale no civilization matched for thousands of years afterward. The monuments are not evidence of mystery. They are evidence of mastery. The mystery was only ever in our refusal to look closely enough at what was already right in front of us. And if Hancock was right about this, after 40 years of being told he was wrong by every institution with the authority to say so, then the question is no longer whether he was right about corundum. The question is, what else the textbooks have wrong? The proof is in the corundum. The corundum is in the granite. It has been there for 4,000 years, waiting for someone to stop trusting the answer that was already written down and start asking whether anyone had actually checked. Here is the thing about proof. It does not announce itself. It does not walk into archaeology departments and demand to be examined. It sits in stone, in cut surfaces, in molecular signatures invisible to the naked eye, waiting for someone with the right instrument and the right question and the stubborn refusal to accept that the textbook answer is good enough just because it has been the textbook answer for a long time. That is what happened here, and it will happen again, on other questions, in other ancient sites. Every time someone is willing to look more carefully than the field has bothered to look before. Subscribe, because what you just watched is not the end of this story. It is the beginning of the next question.